All right, folks, we're going to get started. And we have all of our lovely panelists and moderator here now to join us. So welcome. You can see us all here together in the Portland building room in downtown Portland. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Marta, to kick us off. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon or morning still. It's so good to be here with all of you. Welcome to our sixth in a series of panels about leadership through and into a new form of government. Today's panel is designed to provide opportunities to learn from and dialogue with leaders from peer cities. So my name is Marta. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the National Program Manager with Power the Polls, which is a nationwide initiative to support election administrators. I'm also a former member of Portland's Independent District Commission last year, where I helped develop Portland's first ever city council geographic districts. And before we get started, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing their experience, as well as for Katie and the transition team staff for their work organizing today's panel and bringing this great group together. So as part of this panel series, in today's panel, we will specifically be hearing from city leaders and policymaking experts on how to deliver services in a districted city. So when I went through the Independent District Commission process last year, the IDC heard a couple of really strong takeaways about this transition to a districted city. So first, we learned that Portlanders are willing to take a big risk, right? Like establishing brand new geographic districts, multi-member districts, like this is a really big risk for our city, but Portlanders are hungry for something different and change. The second thing that I really heard as part of the IDC process is Portlanders want to see collaboration. They are eager for folks to work together within districts and among districts. And the third piece I would say is Portlanders really see this new model of government as an opportunity, especially to think about how we center historically disinvested in communities as we think about what the future of our city looks like. So super excited to be convening and moderating this panel today. And it's our hope that today's discussion will do three things. First, highlight some strategies that can help our city implement services equitably across districts with different histories of investment. Secondly, clarify roles and responsibilities for directing those resources. And third, understand how community input is used to inform the electeds versus the administrative staff's decision-making. A few process points. There will be time for questions from all of you in the room for our panelists at the end. We'll be recording the presentation up until that Q&A, and the video will be posted on the Transitions webpage. We'll share the link with a written summary. Please do hold questions and comments until the prepared section of the conversation is over. And when we do reach that time, we will ask that you raise your hand if you have questions so that Katie, who's the go-between between the room and the Zoom, can facilitate the question section. But with that, I am so excited to welcome our three fabulous panelists today. And we'll start off with some brief introductions. So please introduce yourself, briefly describe your position, and also tell us about some of the dynamics influencing how you think about delivering services across districts in your area. We've got a great mix of theory and practice here today. So we'll start with Jennifer and then go to Veronica and Gabriel. Jennifer, please kick us off.
Thank you so much, Marta. And again, just thank you so much for inviting us into this space. I'm humbled and honored to be able to share our story and our journey in this work. So as Marta has shared or said briefly, so my name is Jennifer Chow, and I am the director of the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods. I am of Mian ethnicity and identify as she, her. For folks that don't know, Department of Neighborhoods was formed in 1991 for civic engagement and access to government resources. And that vision for our department is still true today. However, we have adapted to the changing needs of community. Our approach to delivering services across districts to make sure it is equitable is based on our two principles, which we call our North Stars. I'll share a little bit more about that later. But to name them here, it is to put race and equity at the center of every decision and action, and to invest in the power of communities to forge their own solutions. And those are our guiding principles in all our decision making. So by leaning on our guiding principles, we prioritize impacted communities that have been historically underrepresented and underinvested.
Thank you,
All right.
Jennifer. We'll hear a lot more about that. Yeah, Veronica, over to you. Thank you.
So good afternoon from Houston. My name is Veronica Davis. I am the former Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations for the City of Houston. I'm also the author of Inclusive Transportation, a manifesto for repairing divided communities. Very briefly, during my time at the City of Houston, I actually was nestled within the Department of Public Works, which also included Houston Water, drinking water, wastewater, capital projects, and the permitting center. One of the things I know that I was talking with Katie the other day about my role, I probably had one of the most unique situations where I had decentralized implementation, but centralized decision making. And what that means within the city of Houston, which I have worked for cities all across this country, this is the first city that I'm aware of with this particular model. You have management districts, you have tax increment reinvestment zones who are allowed to build in our right of way, not just maintain it. They are allowed to do capital improvement projects. They are eligible for federal funding for capital improvement projects. And so with that, it'll actually allowed us to implement a lot of things very quickly because we had several hands on it. And I had an entire team just dedicated to monitoring all of those projects to make sure that they are building what we would like to see and met the vision of the city. So that is part of the key to our success for how we got a lot of projects implemented very quickly. But then as it relates to equity, a lot of the Black and Brown communities do not have these management districts or these tax increment reinvestment zones. And so at the time, the previous mayor had complete communities, and there was 10 of them total, and they developed their own action plan. My staff had no say on what was written in any action plan. It was provided to us, and then we were to develop a plan to implement. And so with that, as we looked at the bipartisan infrastructure law money that became available, almost all of it that is coming to Houston is going into one or more of these complete communities, as well as leveraging private foundation money for these complete communities. And so I'm happy to talk more about that. And then separately in the district's perspective, um, things can get very political very fast, being honest. When people have a district, they feel very, they own it. And sometimes there can be conflicts between the district council members and the at-large council members when people feel like their district council member is not listening to them. But the way my funding was set up, I had two pockets of money that was literally council driven. So each of the different districts on the transportation side got $500,000. And on the drainage side, they got $1.8 million. And they got to define how we spent that money. And so it was definitely partnership. They were required to go out and do their own outreach and their own engagement. And then we did the implementation of it. And so it was a really good program. It helped the council members to have a little bit of political cover when maybe something wasn't a priority of the administration. They could then use this funding to direct accordingly to meet some of the needs of their constituents. And so I'm happy to go into more of those mechanics. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much.
No, I already have so many follow-up questions, Veronica. This is great. Gabriel will round us out here, and then we'll transition to getting into the juice of it.
Yeah, much appreciated. Hello, everybody. Welcome from the city of Albuquerque in New Mexico. My name is Gabe Sanchez, and looks like I'll be representing kind of the research and data piece to our conversation today. I'm based in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico. I'm a political science professor, oversee our Center for Social Policy, which essentially provides the data and backbone for City of Santa Fe, City of Albuquerque, State of New Mexico, in terms of ensuring that the community's input is included in policymaking decisions. So whether it's in New Mexico or in my national roles, I'm also a senior fellow at Brookings. And we have a project right now, which is one of the reasons I got connected to your efforts, that essentially tries to provide cities and states with some background resources, whether they're templates or suggestions, to again ensure that the community's input is included through the full duration of the process. So I'll be speaking a lot to the mechanics of how you go about doing that through research, what you should be thinking about in terms of data for evaluation, etc. And in closing, I'll note I'm also director of research for a research firm called BSP Research, We do polling and qualitative data. And all that, again, is intended to be thoughtful about ensuring when you engage the community in all these different decisions and deliberations, that you do that in a way that speaks to, as everybody's noted on the panel, the full totality of community members. And the long story short is, whether it's a survey, qualitative interviews, focus groups, you tend to attract naturally the people who are most engaged in the political process already, who want to share their opinions with the city of Portland, right? Those folks tend to skew differently demographically, their race, ethnicity, their age, all those different matters than the segment of the population who you want to hear from, but who are not naturally going to raise their hand and say, yes, please sign me up to talk with you in a focus group. So I'll try to emphasize how important it is to be intentional about how you design the data process to make sure that all voices are heard and not just those that tend to be already active and engaged in the political system. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. Definitely, I think throughout this process, this question of how do systems and processes themselves really center those ideas of equity and representation. And, as this group explores approaches to policymaking and implementation across districts, one of the things we're really digging into is whether policy interventions and resources tend to be more place-based, like specifically focusing on underserved neighborhoods or districts, or should a city tend to favor a more uniform pursuit of broad policy objectives across the entire city, and kind of like what's that balance? So given all of that and your fantastic expertise in both theory and practice, I'm curious to hear from all of you, what strategies have you used to ensure that equitable distribution of resources and that resources are allocated equitably to address the needs of a city, especially in historically underserved districts? How do you measure success, and what data and indicators do you use? So kind of strategies, measuring success, data, and indicators. So Veronica, we'll start with you, and then we'll go Gabriel and Jennifer.
So I'm going to say the quiet part out loud. You can't meet the needs of the community. I'm sorry. I don't care what city in the United States, the problems of that city exceed budgets. It exceeds the staff that you have available. It exceeds your consulting capacity. You can't meet the needs of the city. You can't. To me, at the end of the day, it comes down to having a vision and being able to prioritize that vision. Um, I know it's kind of the unpopular thing to say, but it is the truth. And so when I look at my time at the city of Houston, the city of Houston is a physically large city. Just for some context, it's the size of New York plus Seattle plus Miami plus Minneapolis plus DC with square miles left over. So if I could dispatch all of my crews, I could dispatch all my engineers, and we would never touch the whole city. And so part of it is, I'm going to take it from two parts. When it comes to operations, so under my purview, I was responsible for operations and maintenance as well. So operations and maintenance of traffic signals, roads, both concrete and asphalt, the open ditch system, the closed drainage system. So all of that was under my purview. So with that, I will say we did not originally, when I started, we were district based and how we delivered those type of maintenance services. And it doesn't make sense because the boundaries of a district don't necessarily lend to operational efficiency. So what we did on for the vegetation crew, as an example, we did all the mowing in the city. We were agnostic to the district boundaries and actually focused on operational green zones because we didn't want to have to keep moving equipment all around and then double backing across this very large city. So in that case, we were able to, with that, go from barely getting to the entire city in a year to getting to the entire city about every 3 times a year. Sorry. And so that's just an example of some of your operational aspects are going to have to be independent of whatever your council boundaries are. But when it comes to funding, and particularly when you comes to underserved neighborhoods, they're underserved for a reason. You haven't provided any investment. And so with the complete communities model, I had actually the political cover because we were told these are the highest priorities. These 10 communities that we've identified because of who lives there and because they have no infrastructure, they are the highest priority. So you need to prioritize them. And so when it came to going after federal funding, we prioritized them. When it came to doing maintenance of our roadways, we elevated them in the priority to make sure to do the repaving there, the overlay there. As we look to drainage and even doing rehab projects, we actually honed in on one particular neighborhood. And so for the next 3 years, we have rehab projects for the drainage system in one particular neighborhood. So I will say that there are going to be things that you're just going to have to make a decision. And that's where having this other pot of money available to the council districts assisted with some of that political cover. Because if I have to tell a very rich neighborhood no, they could at least run to their council member, and their council member could use their funds for that drainage project or that transportation project in that neighborhood. But we literally were driven by the fact that, equity is not about everybody gets what they need. Equity to me is really about prioritizing those with the highest need. And so that's how we operate it. And I'm happy to elaborate more as we go through the conversation.
Thank you so much. Gabe, we'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think Veronica said a lot of great things that I would support in terms of, the dynamic is often politics sometimes drive a lot of these decision making, and that's just what it is. I don't think that's anything you can, necessarily get around. But I think my experience has been you're going to have to think about this as a mix of citywide priorities and implementation taking place at the district level. And I'll give you a couple of examples to emphasize that. Recently, I can't remember if it was the city of Santa Fe or the city of Denver. I led a project basically to do something similar to what you all are talking about. Identify what are the overarching priorities citywide across that entity. We utilized a survey to do that. Oftentimes the mayor, right, is going to define for you what those broad categories of issue priorities are based on what they feel they're accountable to for the voters on the campaign that they just had and all the conversations they've had with voters across the city. So they might say, look, the priorities for us, my term, are going to be crime, right? Might be something that we're seeing percolate across the country, and maybe homelessness, right? So they've identified that those are the primary issues that they want to see implemented across the city. But if you do due diligence and you capture data from the community across districts, what the population feels the needs are, even within those pre-existing categories of homelessness and crime, are going to vary substantially, right? So you might hear from certain segments of the city that homelessness and crime to them are correlated, right? And they want to see efforts that address both of those simultaneously. But in other areas of the city, they're going to say, look, we see crime as an issue that's the most important to tackle. Homelessness is something for other districts in the city to be concerned with. So you're going to have to prepare yourself for the noise of that reality. It's not always going to be uniform. You're going to have some districts that are saying, why are we focusing on that issue? That's not something we care about in this community. And so the thing that you're going to have to be mindful of is hopefully constantly collecting data at the district level, right, to figure out what the nuances are to those priorities that the mayor or the city council might set as those being political realities. And probably my experience has been the hardest thing to try to implement from an equity standpoint are the solutions to those challenges, right? So you might all agree that crime is a #1 priority. Districts are going to vary tremendously on the solutions that they perceive are the best for their individual communities to address crime. For example, case point from the study that we just recently did, some districts were saying we want more police activity, we want more police presence where we live, that we think will reduce crime. Or in other areas that might be more racially and ethnically diverse, their perception is more police activity isn't necessarily going to solve the problem and might actually lead unwanted outcomes by just having a heavier police presence, because their experience with police might not be as positive as it is in other districts. So that's been my experience. It's going to be a range of maybe citywide priorities that are set by politics more often than not, and your team having to figure out how to get data at the district level to figure out what exactly does that mean to the actual residents and what do they want to see in terms of policy interventions that actually do something about those priorities.
Absolutely. And in Portland, with like geographically pretty large districts and multi-members in those districts, it's going to be the quite a balance and negotiation. That's super helpful. Jennifer, do you want to close us out on this one?
Thank you, Marta. I think Veronica and Gabriel gave really wise nuggets, a lot of golden nuggets. What I'll just add is, so for this current administration, for sure, for the departments, we report to the executive branch. We still have to work with our council because our council districts, and we have 7 council districts. And with that, there's a lot of, I would say, yes, prioritization depending on which constituents have the loudest voice. But with this, our administrator, at least this year with Mayor Harrell, his vision of One Seattle has a lot of shared values with our new council. This is the first year in Seattle that we've had 5 new council members start this year. And so some have never been involved in government. And so there's a lot of learning and stretching together. But with that said, those priorities do really come from community. And I would say that as someone who is of Mian ethnicity, who immigrated as a Seattleite here and grew up here at 2 years old, my own lived experience really propelled me to do the work that I'm doing now. And with that role, and I'll talk a little bit about how that leads to the strategy that we're doing with DON, or the Department of Neighborhoods, is that as an immigrant who wants to make sure that voices are all included, is all inclusive with everyone else, I always say it's not that we are taking people from the table, but it's actually we're adding more seats so that people can join the table. So leading to that, I'll say, I don't believe it's a one size fits all approach, that's for sure. Veronica tapped that, and also Gabriel around data. For example, when the city of Seattle was developing the housing affordability and livability agenda, there was a mix of strategies centered on broad policy objectives, and that mattered to everyone. But there were those that specifically focused on addressing needs within historically underserved neighborhoods, and that was based on data. We've also had other targeted policy efforts around neighborhood planning, generational wealth, and more that have intentionally centered on communities with histories of harm, disinvestment, and displacement. Both approaches are necessary and useful because it brings everyone in. When we talk about creating One Seattle and inclusion and belonging, we are not talking about creating a monolith. What we are talking about is making sure that every unique neighborhood gets their needs met the way that they need it to be, and equitably, not equally, because every fair share does not work for every community, but equitably so that they can thrive. And not every neighborhood has to, and communities have to thrive in detriment to each other. That is something the Department of Neighborhoods believe. And when we talk about priorities for this administration and for the council, it is public safety right now, it's community safety, it is also homelessness. And I think that's worldwide, right? And so with that, the way that we support that through policy and strategy is community activation. Because if we are activated, and if we are all thriving, and if we're connected to each other and have access to government, then that creates more safety. The last thing I'll leave with is what's most important is being intentional, strategic, and transparent with community, and working as a unified city to engage community members in the work. Regardless of the policy or program, it is vital to advocate for the active involvement of communities to contribute to the development of their own solutions. It is my firm belief that when communities are engaged, they not only survive, but they thrive. They actually don't want a one-off. So when we're in engagement with communities, especially communities of color, Black and brown communities who have been underrepresented, who have historically been left out of access to create policy and decision-making, they have said, we appreciate that you come and you clean our neighborhoods, but the next day or the next month, it is actually back to the way that it was before. What we're asking for is 100 years of investment. And what Veronica is talking about, right, that our budget is not enough. But we are talking about after my generation, I want my children's and children's generation to thrive. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to ensuring equitable allocation of services and resources, one major tool all city departments use is the City of Seattle Racial and Social Justice Equity Index. So this index combines data on race, ethnicity, and related demographics with data on socioeconomic disadvantages and health disadvantages. It comes out of our Office of Planning and Community Development. So it is an index that all the city departments look at to make sure that we are looking at those who are most underrepresented, who have the most history of harm, who are underinvested. It is calculated and mapped at the census tract level to indicate where people of color and other marginalized populations make up relatively large proportions of neighborhood residents. And this tool helps us in identifying geographic priorities for city programs, planning efforts, and investments. So it helps us to be consistent and aligned. This index also provides departments with a common foundation of data about neighborhood demographics to help inform and align allocation of resources to advance equity consistent with our Seattle's Race and Social Justice Ordinance. So it's a mouthful and it's a lot, Marta, but I just wanted to share that information and would love to send the link to you all, and you can share with the group, with the audience.
Please do. Yeah, absolutely. I would say even if you drop it in the chat, Katie can probably include it in the notes. I love the idea of that index, right? Because it's to be able to actually quantify something, right? Yeah, I see a thumbs up. Amazing. And that's actually a perfect segue to the next question. So I wanted to really kind of home in on this question of community involvement. And would love to hear from all of you how you think a department should receive information from community members, elected officials, and others that actually informs the planning and delivering of city services. And I'm curious especially to hear a specific example of how district-specific feedback has shaped policies and initiatives in a department or city. So Gabriel, we'll start with you to speak from like a research perspective, some best practices of integrating community engagement. And then Jennifer and Veronica, perhaps some specific examples from both of you.
Yeah, excellent. And this is probably the question I'll speak to in more detail than some of the others because it's a little bit more research and data focused. But without getting too much in the weeds of the mechanics of collecting data, surveys, in-depth interviews, focus groups, those things I can help out with down the line, if helpful, to just give folks some examples of how you go about the process of doing this in a rigorous way. But to focus more on best practices, a couple of things that you should start thinking about now is typically cities collect a ton of data from community members, but it's usually siloed, right? Department X needs a transportation study, so they want feedback on where should that occur across the city. And then Department Y needs information about crime or housing, so they put out RFPs for research teams like ours to collect that data. What very seldomly happens is for the city departmental level units to talk with each other about who's going to put out RFPs for what, how is that data going to be utilized, so that there can be a little bit more systemic structure in what you're asking the community to participate in. Over time, right, the city, particularly in the underserved segments of the population, get oversaturated with requests to provide data, right? There's constant requests to show up to this event. We need your feedback. We need to hear from you. And over time, city residents start to feel like, hey, somebody was just here last week talking to us about something very similar. Can't the city just coordinate all of that, right? And you're going to hear that often from community if you're not thinking about this in a systemic way. So that's one just really good, important best practice to think about. Coordination of data requests, because you're asking residents to invest their time, right? So you want to make sure that you're doing that as seldom as possible, but getting the information that you need from participants in the community. Next thing is a best practice. Very few times have I actually seen this implemented, right? Sometimes the city, I've done a lot of these for various cities, has big, huge events, which you should think about as mechanisms to collect data. If you're going to bring people together, use that as an opportunity, whether that's breakout sessions where you have researchers talk individually to people when you're breaking them out into different rooms, etc., whether that's passing out a survey at the event. Use every one of those opportunities as a mechanism to get voice from the community. But the really important piece of the puzzle that hardly ever is done is reporting back out to the population on what it is that you found and how that cycled into decision-making processes. Very seldom is that actually reported out to community. And what that tells the community is, yeah, this was all just window dressing, right? You brought us together, you asked us for our input, but you're not actually going to use that to make important decisions. Report back out, whether that's directly in another event, communicating to people what was learned and how it filtered into decision-making processes, or maybe it's a web page that you host at the City of Portland's platform, and you put results to all of those studies there and direct people to that so they actually see there's a point to their time investment to provide their input. That seldomly happens. So if you can do that, you'd be ahead of most cities and jurisdictions in thinking about that. Finally, when you think about collecting data, typically folks will reach out to me, as a survey researcher and say, we want a rigorous survey done that's citywide, but broken up by city council district, right? So we can look at variation from that. I often tell people there's a number of different ways to do this, but I would recommend these days you do a mix of a rigorous, randomly selected survey, right? That has all the bells and whistles you're used to seeing with a survey that's intentionally designed to be representative of the city's full population in those districts. However, by doing that systemically, I'll tell you, you're excluding large segments of the population that might not have the highest voting records from that data collection process. So what we advise people to do is stand up that, rigorous, quote unquote, rigorous survey that's been randomly selected with open source data that allows all segments of the population to provide their voice. And you can do this in a creative way. We've designed studies, for example, that utilize all public entities that have computers, the libraries, right? those things where population can go to utilize a computer, you just have a running screen that says, please take this survey if you have time. It'll only take you 5 minutes and it's focused on crime or whatever the what is. That allows constant data to come in. And then you just have a researcher put the rigorous survey data that's been designed to be representative alongside the community source data. And if they do it well, all of that data can be filtered in to lead to important policymaking decisions, but the community can see their voice was heard alongside the fancy survey that was conducted by a survey firm, right? So that would be one mechanism to make sure you're getting wide input from everybody, but you still can say if you're asked, right, is this data rigorous? Yes, we actually hired a survey firm to conduct this, so we know that it's representative, the margin of error, all that is in place if you need it for that purpose. I said a lot there, but hopefully some of that is helpful.
That's great. Jennifer, I'm going to pass it to you to talk about kind of what this looks like in practice and your experience and when we talked about community engagement coordinators.
No, this is perfect. Gabriel set me up. I mean, his research, now I'm going to tell you how we do put it into practice because everything he said is on point. So as the engagement arm of the city, the Department of Neighborhoods is, I want to just hone in on feedback loop, what Gabriel said. It is so important because in our experience with community engagement and just with all diverse communities, their response is always, you collect information from us, you are uncoordinated, you ask the same question, 10 different departments came out a month ago, and also you don't share, we've already told you our vision, why are you asking us again? And then what do you do with our information? So we need you to come back and tell us what you've done with our information and whether or not we've used it or did we consider it. Community has said what we care about is that you heard us, you acknowledged it, and then you were honest about what was feasible. So I believe feedback is a gift and it is based on trust. If communities are providing input, we should consider their feedback. We also need to recognize that is not a one-size-fits-all approach, as I've mentioned before. It is important to recognize that diversity with each community, especially among ethnic groups, understanding that no community is a monolith. Within each community, there are culturally specific preferences for communication and engagement, and it is critical that we develop approaches in partnership with community to honor those preferences. The value of a city council district model like we have in Seattle is that it provides another vehicle for gathering input to better understand the experience of community members in specific neighborhoods. As a city department focused on outreach and engagement, we are out in community on a regular basis, acting as a bridge between community and government. We bring information back and forth from community, other city departments, the mayor's office, and city council members. This information is used to shape strategies, inform decision-making, and provide clear understanding on both sides. So working with our council members that represent specific districts and then their constituents has helped guide many of the city's policies and programs. And many of the council members actually lean on our department because of the community engagement that we do, because our whole focus is civic engagement and relationship building. It has influenced implementation of zoning regulations like the mandatory housing affordability policy and transit projects like the light rail expansion in the Chinatown International District.
Veronica, close us out. I love
I
this. I'm
know.
inspired.
Look, I'm like, I don't really don't have much to add. So I'm going to actually approach this from two different ways. So I just want to say on the practical side, shameless plug for my book. I actually talk a lot about different projects I worked on and how you engage people, especially from my world. You're coming from a very technical world. And so therefore, it's not always tell me what you want. I can't give you what you want. You know, I got $1 million. So we are limited to what I can do with $1 million. And so it comes down to being honest, to say, hey, this is what I can and can't do. If you want the $10 million project, you're going to have to wait. We just don't have $10 million. So I talk a lot in my book about different projects I worked on, different tactics. Really, Jennifer's point of, sometimes some communities, it is showing up on the first of the month at the grocery store because everybody is there. And some communities, it is showing up after church, because community church is an anchor or a pillar for that community, particularly if it's a certain immigrant community. That is their anchor for all parts of life. I talk about setting up meetings in bus stops. That is probably the most effective thing you can do if you really want to reflect the community. Go to where they are. I've had a project in DC where we actually engage the unhoused populations to understand that just because someone's sleeping on the street doesn't mean that they're not going to work. You do have a lot that are going to work and are moving through the system, but you don't know if you don't go talk to them. And so it is important to do engagement. On the other side of this, I want to talk about the operations and maintenance side, um, because I think that sometimes cities can over rely on 311. 311 is absolutely an important data source, an important way for the community to express a need very easily, whether it's through phone, and I'm sure that you guys have some type of a system similar. But what happens too is within my team, I had an entire dispatch just geared toward being customer focused because there were certain things that could be 311, like a traffic signal is out. Okay, that is a very tactical, it's out, and now we turned it back on and we close that loop, it's on. But then there are times when the community's trying to express something, but the buttons don't quite get them where they need to go, or they can't quite explain the issue. And so with that internally, I had a team that would actually follow up with that constituent and say, Ms. So and so, I see that you put in a 311 request. I want to make sure I understand. Do you have some photos that you can email me? Do you have some other things that you can see? I'm going to send an inspector out to meet with you. Do you mind if they come and knock on your door? Okay, you don't mind? Great. So Mr. So-and-so will be at your house tomorrow at 3 o'clock so that you can explain what the situation is. And to me, it's important to have that level of customer service and then closing things out. Because what I don't want is for that person to run to their council member, and then their council member emails me, and everybody wants me to escalate whatever the situation is. And a lot of times it doesn't need to be escalated. We can still get it completed within our service level agreements. So it is important to have that level of customer service. Now, I will say, I think how Houston has it set up, it could be way more efficient, but we are where we are. And even on the dispatch side, because of a lot of what I did was 24/7, my dispatch team was 24/7. So anytime you called about an issue that was under my purview, someone is always going to take your phone call, even if it's 2 o'clock at night in the morning, and we would be there. And there have been times that I've been woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning, because it's that serious of an issue that we need to get out there. But everything that they say, cosign. And again, I go a little bit more in depth of my book, even talking about different types of stakeholders. And I do want to take a little personal privilege, if I can, to just talk about, in my book, I talk about the silently suffering. And as Gabe mentioned before, you have a community meeting, we know who's showing up. I don't really care what neighborhood you do that meeting. You can probably go through the entire meeting attendee list of who's going to show up. It's like they're just professional meeting attendees. And so it's important to really get to the silently suffering. And as an example of that, of what I consider silently suffering, it's people who are they are trying to survive. They are trying to get through the day. It's not that what you're saying isn't important. It's not that public safety isn't important. It's not that this bus route isn't important. It is, I am trying to just get through this day. I'm trying to get through the next bill. I'm already X number of bills behind. And an example of this is when we look back at COVID, at the beginning of COVID, because we, still kind of lurking around. But when you look at the beginning of the pandemic and we shut down the transit systems because they weren't safe, and we applauded doctors and nurses for all that they did on the front line, and they were absolutely gave it their all. But we never talked about the janitorial staff that was there cleaning the hospitals, cleaning the clinics, and we never thought about how they got to work. We just shut down the system because no one's going to work anymore. And you had many people who had no access to be able to get to work. When you look at the grocery stores, many of us had the privilege of being able to go on an app and say, I need milk and bread and some bananas, and magically it showed up on the doorstep. But there were people who worked at grocery stores who were stocking the grocery stores. There were the delivery trucks stocking it. And so we forgot about all those people in our conversation. And so that's what I call the silently suffering. It's how are we actually centering them in the work that we do and the decisions that we need to make? And how are we intentionally and proactively going out to reach them?
Absolutely. This idea of like meeting people where they are, right? And that's such a common theme that I've heard among the three of you. So I want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So if you're in the Portland Building Room and have questions, think of them. But I will ask the panelists one more question myself, which is, knowing that Portland is establishing districts for the first time, what advice would you give this group to take advantage of the district structure to achieve something we haven't in the past? This could include structures or decision-making processes that you've seen be effective, or other advice. And we'll try to keep this one short and sweet, maybe to a minute or so each, so we've got time for questions. We'll go Jennifer, and then Gabe, and then Veronica.
So I would say prioritize those most impacted and who have been historically underrepresented first. If you include those who have the least access, you will include everyone else. Adopt Targeted Universalism by John Powell. Setting universal goals pursued by targeted universal processes to achieve those goals. So example I'll give is a universal goal could be creating healthy communities, but the targeted process is providing in-language outreach for feedback for what that looks like in different communities and producing and developing individual approaches that are culturally responsive to diverse communities. And that requires investment, right? It won't be a newsletter on a website. It won't be written form a survey, which is for mainstream. People will still give input. But if you prioritize those who have historically been underrepresented, individualized approaches, culturally responsive to their communities, you will bring everyone else in and everyone else along.
Very briefly, a couple things to think about. One is, which nobody does, unfortunately, and makes it tough for the evaluation process to be effective. Start thinking about your quote unquote baseline data now, right? What measures do you already have that you think are important that are creation of the districts, so that 10 years from now, you're going to want to know the answer to the question, are things different? Are they better than they were in the prior system? The only way you can answer that question, if you start getting a handle on what measures you have now and start to think about new measures that you don't have now that you want to collect information on that you think are important and you want to prioritize. So start thinking about that now. The other thing you should start thinking about, in the horizon, now that you've got districts, you're going to have to worry about some things you've never had to think about, like the redistricting process, right? You got some time to start thinking about that. I will tell you, as somebody who spends a lot of their time every 10 years thinking about redistricting, that's a very political and nasty process. So all the bad stuff that comes with the politics of having separate districts will surface during the redistricting process. You got some time to start setting things up so you can be prepared for that process now, but 10 years will get here very quickly, right? It's not 10 years anymore. You're thinking about 6 years from now, you're going to be thinking about redistricting. So start putting your brain out in front of that. Finally, anytime you're thinking about collecting information from the public, for you all, this is a brand new phenomenon, right? For population, they've always thought about themselves within the area that they live in within the city. So thinking about a district's going to be new for them, but thinking about where they live and their priorities based on where they live in a geographical boundary, that's how they've always thought about their lives. So don't shy away from the fact that a lot of them are already going to be thinking about these things in terms of where they live in place.
Yeah, so Gabe took one of mine, and that was going to be the redistricting process. I have been through it now as a city staffer, and I have been through it on a community side. During my time in the District of Columbia, you're going to have to plan for it. You are going to have to fund it. So think about those things now, even though it may be a few years off, and it gets very political very quickly, no matter what type of process that you do and what type of engagement that you do, it can get very political. So just be thinking about that and reaching out to other peer cities to understand how they do that redistricting. On the other side of it, I will say, this is less of a kind of a hard and fast rule, but a thing that could be challenging sometimes for the district itself representatives is that for the at-larges, it's trying to figure out what your rules of engagement are going to be. Because a lot of times constituents are going to keep poking until they can get someone to listen to them and say yes. And so oftentimes a district council member may be involved and may work on an issue. And if people don't feel like they're going somewhere, then they start involving the at-large council members. Or even worse, they just go to the at-large council members and ignore the district council members. So a lot of that's going to be cultural, right, amongst that particular council, but it is going to be something to think about is what are going to be the rules of engagement? Will an at-large council defer to the district council member? Will they loop in the district council member? Because all of those things can muddy a lot of relationships. And the other side of it is, I will say, being in Houston and being in a place where the council members have a direct bucket of money that they can direct to different projects, it is very helpful. I mean, Houston is a strong mayor form of government, but we still worked with a lot of our council members. And so it made it easy sometimes with the council member. We had 11 districts in Houston, plus your 5 at larges. And so there are times when it's important. I'm not saying that what you're telling me is not important. It's just we have things that may be higher priority. And it was nice to be able to tell a council member, like, hey, council member, if this is so important to you, you have money left in your council district service funds. Would you like to use that money for this project? And it really was helpful in that way, to protect city staff in a sense of not feeling pressured to elevate certain projects. We could actually go to the council member and say, hey, we're tracking your funds. You have money left in your funds. Would you like to use it for this project? And again, we gave them each a $500,000 for transportation. And then we gave them 1.8 million for drainage, which went up last year. So they actually got double last year. And it was very helpful that they could nominate and they could pick. We would go through the engineering and then implement the project with them. So just having that consideration. And then also too, I would say what I saw in DC is be very careful not to just give, to divide things up by districts. In DC, they have 8 wards. And so things like sidewalks, as an example, they divide the sidewalk funding evenly by 8. But you have some parts of the city where the sidewalks are in really great condition. You have some parts of the city that don't have sidewalks at all. So installing sidewalks is significantly more expensive than maintaining sidewalks. So think about those things of don't just have blanket, everyone gets the same, for some of your major infrastructure programs. Really make sure to try not to get caught in we're going to give everybody a little bit. And so again, it just worked for us on the drainage side. Everyone got the same, but I actually had a separate pot of money that I could use to prioritize where I actually had higher needs.
Thank you. I feel like we could all continue this conversation for several more hours here, but we do have a couple of minutes if anybody in the room has a question. So Katie, I will defer to you there, and I believe we're stopping the recording for the Q&A session as well.